I'm Molly Sanyour. I have a ceramics business, Molly Sanyour Ceramics. I am a high school ceramics teacher, and going back to college, I have a degree in ceramics. Today, we're going to specifically talk about the stages of clay. Clay goes through stages depending on if it's really wet or really dry. And unless you fire your work in the kiln, it can go through these stages. So when you get your clay, ideally it comes in the plastic state, which means it's been covered in plastic so that the water, the moisture in there, keeps the clay pliable, moldable. You can throw it on the wheel, you can squeeze it, you can push it, you can score and slip it. It is ready to be used. This is in the plastic state. Let's say that we're throwing on the wheel and you throw a bowl in the plastic state and then you leave it to dry for a little bit. As the moisture leaves the clay then enters the leather hard state, which is perfect for carving and trimming, like that bowl. Once it dries that nice leather hard, you're ready. Once it's left the plastic state, it's dried up just a bit. That is when you want to carve your pots, trim your pots. Now, if you forget to wrap your pots or you're done and you love your piece and you just leave it and all of the moisture dries out, there's no moisture left. The clay is then in the bone dry state. This is the most fragile and brittle state of all of the stages because there's no moisture in it to help hold the clay together. It is just dried out clay that's ready to either be fired or recycled. So at that point, you can still fire or recycle it. You really can't work with bone dry clay. You cannot attach two pieces of clay together if one of them is bone dry. So you do need the moisture to be able to attach pieces. So if your clay has reached the bone dry phase, it's either time to recycle it or fire it. Now from the bone dry phase, which I have some examples here, this again is when the clay is the most brittle. You might notice it's a lighter color with my clay body. It goes from being this darker clay in the slip form, which we'll get to this lighter clay as the moisture leaves it. So in the bone dry phase, I can just break this clay very easily. If I grind it up, it does become clay dust and dry ingredients, which you always want to avoid working with dust in a clay studio. Any dust that gets in the air, it can get in your lungs, and over time it can kill you. Silicosis and all the other dust and particles, you just don't want them to get in your lungs. So always avoid working with dry clay. And if you do, make sure you wear a respirator. And you even can take a spray bottle and spritz the air to help keep the dust down. Now, when your clay becomes bone dry, and if it turns or you're using just dried ingredients, some people make their own clay bodies and they form their own ingredients together to create their own workable clay. But as you take it from the dry state, once you add water to it, you can actually create a slip. And a slip is used like a glue in pottery. You could actually use it for decorative reasons too. You could put it on your pot, create some texture on your surface. But if you are going to combine two pieces of clay together, like a handle to a mug, you've got to use a little bit of slip to help hold it together like a glue. So here we are in the slip stage where we have too much water. As the water leaves the slip stage, it becomes plastic. As it dries, it goes to leather, bone dry, and repeat the cycle. Now, if I've thrown on my wheel and I have scraps or a pot that didn't make it, I'll put it in a bucket. And in that bucket, I'm trying to rehydrate all the clay back down to a nice mushy consistency. So I can take my bone dry scraps and add some water. If the scraps are already wet, I can just put it in the bucket, cover the lid. Then once all the scraps in that bucket are mushy, I will lay my scraps over a plaster slab. So this is a drawer that has plaster in the bottom, and what the plaster does is it absorbs the water out of the clay. So you can take the clay slowly from the slip state to a plastic state. So this slip has been sitting on this plaster slab, and it's at this point now where I can actually roll it up and wedge it back into plastic clay to be thrown on the wheel or worked with. In this bucket, you can see how I had left some slip in the bottom. I strained out all the water because you don't want to put clay down your sink, so you have to be careful as you're getting rid of it as well. So I had a bucket that I was using to work with my clay. All of the clay had settled in the bottom. I strained the water out, left the chunks in the bottom, let it sit, and now it is at this bone dry, dried out state, which there's not much else you can do here, except I can add water, bring it back, put it on my plaster slab, let it sit for a few days, wedge it up, and make something completely new out of it. Now here is a tip and trick when working with your plaster. As the plaster absorbs the water from the clay, the plaster is no longer dry to absorb that water. So between recycling batches, you do want to let your plaster dry completely out. So here we are again, you get your clay in the plastic state. As you work with it and you let it dry slowly, it becomes leather hard. Now, if you ever want to avoid going to leather hard, if you still need to attach pieces, if you're still molding and sculpting and you need your clay to be plastic, wrap it up in a sheet of plastic. Dry cleaning plastic is my favorite because it's soft, it's thin, you can see what's happening underneath of it. So you can always wrap your clay in plastic to keep it plastic. As your clay dries out to leather hard, that's when you want to sign it like you're famous. That's when you want to carve it and trim it. You could still get away with attaching pieces at the leather hard state. And again, if you do attach pieces, you want to wrap it under plastic for 24 hours to let the two pieces of clay become the same moisture level. If you're taking a piece that's plastic and a piece that's leather hard, the leather hard piece is already drier. And as the air takes away the moisture from the clay, that leather hard piece is going to continue to get drier faster, and the plastic is always going to be wet. So by wrapping the two pieces after you attach them with scoring and slipping under plastic for 24 hours, you're allowing the two pieces to become the same moisture level, redistributing the moisture throughout the piece. So if you're attaching at leather hard, make sure you wrap it really well. After it's plastic and it dries to leather hard, when it becomes bone dry, there's nothing else you can do to work with that really, unless you're going to paint it with underglaze, maybe scratch into the surface, but there's no carving, there's no attaching. What you can do is soften up edges at this point and get it ready to get fired. Or if it's a pot that had a hole in it and you're just looking at it, you can recycle it. So from bone dry, you can recycle it by adding water, bringing it back to a slip, setting it out, letting it dry slowly, it becomes plastic. But let's say you're at the bone dry phase and you love it. You're ready to make it permanent on this earth. Then you have to send it through the kiln. And the kiln, after that first firing, that will then become bisqueware. So after your plastic clay has been molded, sculpted, formed, and you put it in the kiln and you fire it, and it comes out of the kiln, it is then bisqueware. Bisqueware can no longer be recycled. Bisqueware has taken your clay to a temperature that has made it permanent on this earth. Is it usable and functional at the bisqueware state? Not really. So if you want to eat or drink out of your pottery, you then have to also send it through a final glaze firing. So here are the stages of clay. Let's talk about over here as you're firing. In temperature terms, we use the term cone. So cone 04 is the cone that I bisque fire to. It's kind of like when you're baking and you bake cookies at 300 degrees, or you're baking French fries at 400 degrees, or a pizza at 500. Well, every time I bisque fire my clay and I want to make it permanent on this earth, I bisque fire to cone 04, which comes out to a Fahrenheit temperature of 1945 degrees Fahrenheit, cone 04. Now on the on the cone chart, you can see how it goes cone 10, cone 6, cone 04, 06, 018. Any cone with an O in front of it is a cooler temperature. So here we're at cone 04. Cone 06 is actually cooler. Cone 018 is even cooler than cone 04 and 06. And the opposite, as we go to cone 6, hotter, cone 10, really hot. So at cone 018, that's when you might be doing a gold luster firing in your kiln, which after you bisque fire, after you glaze, you can do additional glazed applications on top and fire to a lighter temperature to seal those on top like a gold luster firing. Cone 06 might be a low temperature glaze fire. It might be a low temperature bisque fire if you want your clay to remain more porous. You can also fire on decals to cone 06. Cone 04 is again where I typically bisque fire and make my clay permanent in the kiln. And then I glaze fire. After it comes out the bisque fire, I'll paint my glaze on, I'll dip my glaze on, however I want to apply my glaze, and I will glaze fire to cone 6 for my glaze. I'm using a stoneware, kind of mid-temperature range, cone 6. So that's 22, 32, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Some people will be doing soda firings or wood firings where the temperature gets up to cone 10. So know your cone, know your clay body, and know that you can recycle it. Nothing is lost until you fire it, and then that makes it permanent. Hope this video helps. Let me know what else y'all want to see and talk about. And also, if you haven't, check out my website where you can learn more about my Throwing with Molly membership, where we have a clay community of clay enthusiasts of all skill levels from all over the world, talking clay, setting goals, setting challenges, and we have a lot of fun over there. So check it out if you're looking to join a clay community online. See y'all for the next video.